Welcome everybody watching on YouTube to another episode of the Speedrun. It's been some time, so let's get back on track. Hopefully with a Gleck system, fingers crossed. E4, E5, knight F3. So far we've been facing a lot of Philidors, not a lot of knight C6. Not a lot of 4 knights. And there we go. Case in point, we're still facing a lot of offbeat openings. Now, I do distinctly remember an early speedrun episode where I delved quite deep into the theory of what's called the Elephant Gambit. What's really interesting is earlier today I got a chess opening book from the late 1800s, and I saw that the authors analyzed this gambit. They called it something else, so we can take a look after the game at what they recommend and match it with the modern engine. But long story short, there's a couple of ways that white can get an advantage, but the move that I always recommend is knight takes e5. This is the simplest move to remember, and I actually think that it is the strongest move objectively, although e takes d5 also gives a nice advantage to my knowledge. So knight takes e5 is what I've previously played, and now basically black has a couple of options. The most topical move is bishop to d6. Bishop to d6 is the only way to attempt to make this line work. Clearly, our opponent is kind of just winging it, and queen f6 is not the way to go. The response to queen f6 is going to be the same as the response to bishop d6. The point is that we solidify the knight with d2, d4. That simultaneously opens up the diagonal for the bishop, and white seizes a pretty big development advantage as a result. Queen f6 certainly does not help black's cause. Our response is pretty clear. It's going to be d4. And in response to d takes e4, typically we prioritize in this line the development of the knights over the bishops, although, you might also be tempted by the move bishop to c4. I find bishop c4 to be less appealing because of the response bishop e6. And the bishops are at a bit of a standoff, and I'm not sure how that benefits white. So let's start with knight c3. It's a simple developing move. We've got 2 pieces out. Black is just like ignoring our threats. c6. Okay, I'm not sure I understand this move at all. I think our opponent thought that we were aiming for d5 without realizing that we're also attacking the pawn on e4. Now, before we rush to grab it, let's try to understand what happens, because our knights are stuck in the center. They're going to be aligned on the same file, so we have to make sure that the knights don't kind of get caught up in a potential skewer or something to that effect. So what is black going to do after knight takes e4? Okay, probably our opponent is going to drop the queen back to e7, and we've got a million responses to that move. We could even sacrifice the knight on e5 and go for quick development. So there's really nothing much to calculate. Let's go knight takes e4. Clearly this was overlooked by our opponent, and this is already looking catastrophic for black. Absolutely catastrophic. Yeah, go for quack development. Yeah, some duck sounds pretty good right now. Okay, bishop d3. This move should be pretty automatic to you. This sets up a potential discovery against black's queen. Our opponent does need to move some other pieces out in order to win this game. Maybe he didn't get the memo. And actually, I'm not even sure that our opponent will be able to move any other pieces, because the queen is essentially already trapped. I mean, this is how quickly things get bad when you don't bring any pieces out by move 7. This is just a KO. Absolute KO. And I guess I'm wearing a chess bra sweatshirt, so very fitting way to win this game. Queen to e6, another queen move. Now, there's basically 2 schools of thought for how to win a position where you've got a development advantage that's this overwhelming. The sort of, let's call it the Soviet schoolboy method, is just to keep developing. Like, it's, believe it or not, like, I can bet you a silver dollar that if you run this on the computer, and we will after the game, the move short castles is probably going to preserve, it might even be white's best move, which should sound very surprising to you, because when you look at this position, you're probably seeing a couple of much more tempting options that win material, right? You should be seeing at least 2 ways that white can grab material, but sometimes just like developing and then, let's say, putting a rook on the e-file is ultimately going to lead to far greater material gains than rushing to cash in your chips. In this particular instance, we've already got such an overwhelming development advantage that there is no need to get fancy. And the 2 moves that win material are bishop c4, first of all, and the second one is knight to g5, which is the move that I'm going to choose, knight to g5. Because once we take on f7, we trap the rook in the corner. Why did I not choose bishop c4? Well, after bishop c4, black can actually go queen f5, hitting the knight on e4. And you could argue that you could drop the knight back to g3 with tempo. That's also completely winning. It's largely a matter of taste. I mean, this is just winning like 600 different ways, as long as you avoid any major blunders. There's one subtlety, which is that in some instances, we need to be careful about the g2 pawn falling. Okay, our opponent is not aiming to take that pawn. I'll save that for after the game. So here again, technically, we don't even have to rush to take on f7. We could castle short, but why? Like, why overcomplicate things when we can just take the pawn? Let's take it with either knight. Knight e takes f7, knight g takes f7. It doesn't really matter. The only thing to keep track of here, of course, is that we don't want to rush with knight takes h8. The beauty of trapping the rook in the corner like this is that that rook is not going anywhere. The knights are defending each other. So what do we need to do in order to set ourselves up for knight takes h8? Well, you might be thinking, all right, well, let's somehow like move this knight away. And a move like knight to f3 actually makes a lot of sense. But I think that there's a lot better ways to do it, right? So there's two more elegant ways in which we can defend this knight. We can do it directly with queen e2. But as I've been saying many times, short castles should essentially be automatic for you, because now any instance where black takes on e5 will be able to pin the queen with rook e1. So for instance, if black brings the knight out to f6 and prepares to extricate the rook, then we'll be able to take on h8, and the knight is indirectly defended by this rook on f1. And we're also taking care of our kind of last developmental priority, which is just to get the king to safety and out of the center. So the game is over. Okay, bishop e6. That's kind of an ingenious move. The point is, if we play knight takes h8, black wants to play queen takes e5. But you shouldn't stop calculating there. Obviously, even in that position, rook e1 should win the game pretty handily. If we want to avoid those complications, I think we have ways to do that. We can essentially separate the black queen from our knight. And we can do that by chasing the queen around the board until it's forced to lose contact with the knight. You might be inclined to play bishop e3. I'm actually looking at some other options. There's actually a really nice option here, which is a little bit more subtle, which is the move rook e1. We're directly benefiting from our previous move. The only thing you have to see, and you should pause the video here if you're watching on YouTube, what happens if bishop takes f7? And if you're a more advanced player, this will be very obvious. This is a common theme. Of course, we have two different discoveries that win black's queen. Knight c6 or knight f3 picks up an entire queen for nothing. And also, we're setting up devastating threats along the e-file. So I'm belaboring the point here because there's not much to talk about. But yeah, there's going to be like 20 winning moves on every turn. Knight d7, okay, not bad. But here's the thing. One thing that you should notice is that because the queens are locked in an x-ray, if this bishop could move away with check, we would be winning the queen. And the only reason the bishop cannot move away with check is because the knight is essentially blocking the h5 e8 diagonal. So by taking the rook here, we're vacating the square g6 so that it's a check. Or not vacating the g6 square, vacating the f7 square, ensuring that this move is now a discovered check that picks up the queen. And it works like a charm. And hopefully our opponent resigns here. Hopefully our opponent resigns here. Doesn't make us demonstrate the subsequent technique. Also, he's dropping like both pieces on the e-file, so this is pretty depressing. Yeah, definitely not the best game from our opponent. And you can see that demonstrating like very basic sound opening principles leads to an immediate victory. Give me just a second to hunt down the old book, and we'll do a little tour of opening chess history. I'm going to go starting soon for just a second while I hunt down the book. I actually talked about this book a little bit on my Title Tuesday stream earlier today. It's a book called Chess Openings, Ancient and Modern. This is the second edition from, I think, 1896. And it's like a full-fledged opening encyclopedia. The condition of this book is really good, given when it was written. It's like in perfect condition. First and foremost, before I fire up ChessBase and give you an overview of modern theory in this line, let's see what the 19th century bright minds had to say about this line. So I'm going to go to the table of contents. Okay. Summary of the sections into which the king's knight's opening is divided. So we want pawn to queen 4. They call it the queen's pawn counter gambit. So part 3. Section 3. Let's go to section 3. Section 3. So let's read a little bit. I hope this is interesting to people. So this is what they thought of this line in the 1890s. Okay, there we go. D5. This defense is a combination of a counterattack with a development move, releasing the second player's queen's bishop. For this reason, it is slightly stronger than Greco's counterattack by F5, which is now known as the Latvian gambit, as is subsequently shown in Philidor's defense, in which the two lines of play are opposed to each other. In the position on the diagram, that is after D5, if the first player replies to black's second move by taking the king's pawn, he may have a difficult game. So that's already wrong. So let's see what they recommend for black after knight takes e5. Okay, so first they look at pawn takes pawn. We're not necessarily interested in. Now we want to look at knight takes pawn. So they recommend pawn takes pawn. They recommend pawn takes pawn. And they say in the footnote, if bishop to d6, which is the modern main line, pawn to queen 4, d takes e4. Now, maybe somebody can remember, what line do I recommend for white here? I recommend a very modern line for white. Holy smokes, they actually know about it. They actually give this line. This is like the best line according to modern computers, and they figured it out. Almost. Bishop c4. Yeah, so the move I recommend is bishop c4. But what's the caveat? The caveat is that after black plays bishop takes e5, you don't play pawn takes e5, because that allows black to trade queens and we lose our castling rights. You actually play the intermediate move queen h5. And they give this line, queen h5. And if black plays queen e7, then they give pawn takes bishop. Except my recommendation is queen takes bishop, and I'll continue this line in a second. A brilliant variation introduced by Mr. Cochrane comes in here. They also give the move queen to e7, and then they give pawn to d4, pawn to king bishop 3, f6, knight to queen bishop 3, knight c3, we'll check this with the engine, pawn takes knight, knight takes pawn, hitting the queen, queen to queen 3, so queen to d6, pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, bishop to queen 3, bishop to queen 3, pawn to king bishop 4 with a fair game. Not sure what with a fair game means. And the last line they give is pawn takes e4, which is their main line. And they give, let's see what they give. An old variation is bishop c4. This is the winning move for white, by the way. Bishop c4, queen to g5, knight takes pawn. I think the move here is bishop takes pawn, so they give knight takes pawn, queen takes knight pawn, rook to bishop square, bishop to knight 5, pawn to king bishop 3, bishop takes pawn, rook to f2, queen g1 check, here, queen to knight 8 check, rook to bishop square, queen to knight 5 check. Well, that's not a check, but they give queen to g4. Interesting, and they think black is actually better. So what they miss is that, so they believe that d takes e4 is black's best move. And I'm pretty sure, we're going to check with the engine, but I'm pretty sure that what they miss in this position is bishop takes f7 check, king e7, and now there's this move d4. And they just assumed that after queen takes g2, black is better. But I think I've given this before on a speedrun. So let's fire up ChessBase and check this with Mr. Silicon Fiend. I'll pull up the chat as well. Yeah, so they actually figured a lot of stuff out, interestingly. They really were not as dumb in the 1800s as we like to think sometimes. Okay, so I'm going to copy this game to ChessBase. Yeah, so let's do a quick overview of modern theory. So knight takes e5. The main move by far is bishop to d6. Their recommendation of d takes e4 can be a dangerous move if you don't remember the theory very carefully. So bishop c4 is indeed the best move. Now, if black goes queen to d4, which may seem kind of unpleasant to you, then you play bishop takes f7 check. Let's say black moves the king somewhere. Let's say king e7. And here, there's a very important resource. f4. This resource should be remembered. And after e takes f3, knight takes f3, it looks like we're dropping a piece because of queen e4 check. But once the king moves to f2, black can't take on f7 because of the fork on g5, and black is completely lost. So for that reason, queen to g5 is the main move. And now, indeed, bishop takes f7 check is the best move. I was right. King e7, and now d4 was missed by the 19th century authors. Queen takes g2, rook f1. And very importantly, if black plays bishop h3, you drop the bishop back to c4, protecting the rook on f1. And I'm pretty sure in an old speedrun episode you can find subsequent analysis. But black is lost here. And finally, after bishop d6, which is the modern main line, d4, d takes c4, bishop c4, bishop e5, queen h5. In this position, it's only important to know what to do if queen takes d4. If queen takes d4, you play queen takes f7, king to d8. And now you just go after the material. Queen f8 check, king d7, and just bishop takes g8. And basically, you should pause the video here and figure out what the threat is. What is white's threat in this position? So for instance, yeah, the threat is bishop e6 check, which doesn't mean you play it against everything. But if black plays queen d6 and tries to exchange queens, you play bishop e6 check. And black is in huge trouble because you just win the rook on h8 and the queen easily evacuates. If black plays knight to c6, then you don't play bishop e6 check because you fall behind in development. Here you actually give queen f7 check, and black is in massive, massive trouble. For example, like knight e7, the bishop comes out to g5, then the knight comes out to c3, and you quickly bring a rook to d1. And so for that reason, queen takes d4 is bad. That's why black has to play queen e7. And here, instead of d takes e5, I really like the move queen takes e5. And this endgame is much better for white. D takes e5, knight c6. Here there's a couple of possible moves for white, but I really like knight c3. Prioritizing development over greedy pawn counts. Knight takes e5, you just drop the bishop back to b3. And apart from threatening to win back the pawn, let's say black plays, knight f6, you go bishop f4, skewering the knight and the c7 pawn. And white is much better. You have the bishop pair, big development advantage, and excellently placed pieces. So there's more theory, but I don't want to get too bogged down. That's kind of the stuff that you should know. Queen f6 by our opponent is not a real move. And once d4 happens, I think black is already in huge trouble. D takes c4 and knight c3. I think black's last chance was to play bishop b4 in this position. This really was the only move. I was planning just to play bishop to d2, reinforcing the threat of knight takes e4, and essentially forcing black to give up the bishop pair. So black's position is still absolutely miserable, especially because d5 is coming next. But at least this would have allowed black to stave off disaster. After c6, yeah, we just play knight takes e4, and I think the rest is essentially self-explanatory. Bishop d3 creating the discovered check, knight g5. And really the only subtlety is if bishop takes f7, we go knight takes c6 check, winning the queen. This is very similar, by the way, to the Petrov. This is why in the Petrov you're not really supposed to go knight takes e4 because of the move queen e2. And here there is a line with queen e7, but if black drops the knight back to f6, it's a very similar theme, like the discover check on c6 along the e file, because the e7 square is covered also by the knight. And that's basically all I have for you in this game. Let's get another 10-minute game and hopefully somewhat more combative. All right. I'm going to pull the chat back up, unless there are any questions. After b takes e3, what do you do if e3? There is one quick question. Okay, if e3, just play f takes e3. There's no problem. Yeah, I mean, knight takes f7. I'll let you check that on your own if you want a little bonus work. I want to get to the next game. So the authors of the book recommend knight takes f7 here instead of bishop f7. I'll let you do your research on your own. Let's go. Now we have black against 1582. We will cross 1600 if we win this game. And what do we play again? I think we play this. I'm trying to remember what we play. Sicilian. Okay, let's play a Najdorf. I'm just making sure that that is, in fact, what I'm recommending in the speedrun. Yeah, it is the Najdorf. Bishop c4, so another Bowdler attack. You should already know that the move here is knight f6. And actually, this version of the Bowdler attack, I'm not even sure it's called the Bowdler. When I was introduced to this line, my coach called it the Yudasin variation, named after a Russian GM who now lives in New York, Leonid Yudasin. And yeah, I mean, Yudasin was very well known for essentially playing the Italian against the Sicilian. Now, the entire reason that this is not more popular, of course, is because black can play e6, which is not a move that you can play in the Italian because the pawn is already on e5, so the bishop is much better placed. So you can play e6 in this position, or you can start by developing the knight to c6, waiting for white to put his cards on the table, and now playing the move e6. Now, there is a trap that you have to avoid in this position. This is a very, very common trap, and it's one of the reasons that a lot of people like this setup. The move that essentially loses the game here is bishop to g4, which looks like an entirely reasonable move. You know, let's bring the bishop outside the pawn chain, and then we'll play e6. Who can tell me why bishop g4 comes close to losing the game right off the bat? It's not bishop f7, because after king f7, knight g5, remember the bishop is protected. It's not knight g5, because that hangs the queen, and the king has d7. It's not knight e5. You're seeing the mate, and you're right to see the f7 pawn. But what is the secondary drawback of the move bishop g4? Think about it. What else does it leave exposed? Well, it leaves the b7 pawn exposed, and it leaves the f7 pawn exposed. So this is a Morphy idea. I'll explain that after the game. Queen to b3. And amazingly, black has absolutely no way to defend both b7 and f7 at the same time. Black loses one of these pawns with disastrous effect. So hammer that in your mind. That's why e6 is considered to be the best move here. This is not something that you can ever forget. So you just play e6, and you might say, well, what about this bishop? What are we going to do with this bishop? Well, we'll worry about that a little bit later. But typically the standard option here as a Sicilian player, you should know this, is at some point we're going to expand on the queen side, and that is going to offer the bishop an excellent fianchetto square on b7. That's the sort of long-term accommodation for the bishop. So you should not worry that the bishop is inside the pawn chain in the Sicilian. Now, there are similarities between this and the Italian. White has to know how to play this position in order to not be worse, and clearly our opponent does not. Bishop e3 is not a great move. Now, our response is essentially to complete our kingside development first and foremost. Bishop e7 and short castle. Perhaps you're tempted by the move d6, d5, and that is a totally viable way of handling the position, but I kind of like to maintain the Sicilian spirit. There is no rush. We can play d5 later. This move is not going anywhere. Let's prioritize our development. Well, queen b3 now does exactly nothing, and it kind of walks into knight a5. The reason we don't play knight a5 right away is because the bishop does have the b5 square, so we're not able to grab the bishop pair. Otherwise, we would play knight a5. You can also play a6. I mean, all of these moves can be played in any order. Because the position is kind of closed, the move order here is not going to matter that much. So we can play a6 essentially whenever we want to. But I like to start with kingside development just to make sure the king is nicely tucked away. Piece moves before pawn moves in general. Okay, knight bd2. So again, we can play a6. This bishop on e3 in some cases could end up getting trapped, but that's still in the future. So let's start by castling. In general, yeah. Now I think it's a great time to play a6. Now maybe some of you watching this are tempted by the move knight to g4, and you should remember two things. The first is, even if you are allowed to play knight g4 and then knight takes e3, it's really not the end of the world for white. And in the Italian, this kind of structure is very common. White plays f takes e3, and white gets this semi-open f-file. And white gets a very compact center. It may look ugly, but white controls a lot of squares in the center. The other thing to remember is knight g4, the bishop can slide up to f4. And then later, white will kick the knight out with h3. So this is not a move that you should necessarily be super tempted by. So a6, white plays bishop b3. Let's proceed with b5, just as I indicated. Our next move is likely to be bishop b7. And our opponent is actually demonstrating pretty good knowledge of typical ideas. d4. So I take back what I said earlier. Our opponent is demonstrating good knowledge of like the typical plan here. And it may appear that things have gone wrong for black, because have we allowed white to assert his control over the center? Well, yes and no. This is part of hypermodern openings, is you allow your opponent in most cases to take a larger chunk of the center than you control. But just because he's got pawns in the center does not inherently mean that things have gone wrong for us. And as I'll hopefully show you, black has a lot of dynamic ways to play around white center and ultimately to put a lot of pressure on white center. And if white doesn't handle things really well, white center could end up collapsing very, very quickly. So first of all, we play c takes d4. Now, in this position, again, as a Sicilian player, you should be very tempted to play a particular move automatically because we know for a fact this move is not going to hurt. And that move is rook c8, occupying the semi-open file. Actually, this is not a semi-open file. This is an open file. And now, rook e1 by our opponent. Okay, I think the time has come for us to make a move that I previously discouraged you from playing. What has changed? Well, something very, very specific. In general, if you look at your pawns and you compare them to your opponent's pawns, there's a very common type of situation where if you play e5, your opponent is going to lock up the center with d5 and the bishop is going to be unhappy. If you play d5, exactly the same thing, ditto after e5. However, you can combine two ideas and try to make the move e5 more effective. Let's start with knight g4. Now, in general, because the center is a little bit more open, the bishop pair matters a lot more. Because the white's rook has shifted to e1, now taking on e3 is a lot more enticing because in the event of f takes e3, the rook is just going to look really, really dumb. The second idea, of course, was that if white played bishop f4, we play e5 with tempo, forcing the center open and later forcing the diagonal open for our other bishop. Does that make sense? Okay, so now, of course, we can take on e3, but also I'm seeing a great opportunity to throw in the move knight b4. If the bishop slides to f1, white walks into a fork. If the bishop slides back to b1, well, that essentially self-imprisons the rook on a1, and white's going to have a lot of problems down that c file. White's going to have a lot of problems down the c file. Think about what that means. How can we exploit the c file when white controls all of the squares past c5? Literally all of them. Is there a move we could make to set something up potentially? Right, so all of my moves should be making kind of general sense to you. No, bishop f1 blunders in exchange to knight c2. And notice how we're sort of working around the center. We're playing on both sides of the board, both flanks. The center is kind of not the relevant factor here. Yeah, white controls more squares in the center, big deal. It's not directly relevant to what we're doing. And notice how our pieces start to look very harmonious. The bishop on the long diagonal, the knight on g4, ready to take the bishop at a moment's notice. The bishop from e7 could later come out to f6, the other long diagonal. And suddenly white's under a lot of pressure. Okay, bishop e2, that's the blunder. Now, we could play knight takes e3 first. Why not? Let's snag the bishop pair. And now jumping into c2 with a fork. The additional benefit of this move is that, you know, the e3 pawn is also hanging just in case. Always nice to have that in our back pocket. So, for instance, if white plays rook f1 and panics, we actually can play knight takes e3, which is not unlikely. Okay, bishop d3, that's a decent move. Now, which rook do we take? Well, typically when you're deciding which piece to capture, you want to take the piece that's going to force your opponent to make a passive move or to banish a piece to the side of the board. So obviously here, to me, it's pretty straightforward that we want to go knight takes a1 because now the queen is going to have to waste a tempo or even multiple tempi getting back into the game. So now, broadly speaking, we've won an exchange. Now it's the conversion phase. So I'm looking at the position. I'm saying, okay, well, what does white want? How is white seeking to generate potential counterplay? And because he's played bishop d3, that's a clue that white wants to play e5 and open up the diagonal. So let's make a little deal. We're going to play e5, and we're going to allow white to play d5, but in return, white's bishop is going to be just as stupid as our bishop. And because we're up in exchange, we've got more of an ability to free up that bishop as time goes on. And that's exactly what our plan is going to be. How do we free up the bishop on b7? Well, some of you might be tempted to play f5, but that's a little bit too weakening. I'm going to implement a more positional plan that starts with the move queen b6. Now, when you're implementing any kind of plan, the best kind of plan is one in which the moves when taken on their own merits, also make sense. All right, so this move, even if you don't know what we're doing, makes sense because you're pressuring the pawn on e3. Now, what are some other ideas that you could implement here besides improving this bishop? Well, given that we're up in exchange, we've got 2 rooks and white has 1 rook, what plan immediately jumps to mind? We can actually start by implementing this plan. There is absolutely no rush to improve this bishop. Yeah, rook c7 and rook fc8. Another thing that I like doing is making some luft. We can play h6 or even g6. And the plan of improving this bishop involves playing a5, bishop a6, and then b4. This is a very straightforward idea with the ultimate aim of exchanging the bishops. But let's start by double stacking the rook. We might not even need to improve the bishop just yet. Alternatively, we could play bishop c8, bishop d7. But I like starting with rook fc8 because if white moves the queen, we can actually exchange a pair of rooks with rook c1. This bishop is just chilling. Bishop is just chilling. Okay, well, knight b3 is like begging us to play a5 because now, apart from vacating the a6 square, we're also threatening to push the knight back away from b3, which is an idea that I've talked a lot about. Just very straightforward positional chess. Cramping, and eventually something's going to give. Okay, so we can play a4, we can play bishop a6. Let's start with a4, why not? Now, rook c1, tactically, I think works out. Tactically, I think the move rook c1 works out. If you want to play simple chess, you can play bishop a6. And that's very congruent with the sort of spirit of this game. We're trying to minimize the role of unnecessary calculation. Technically, I can prevent the move rook c1 with queen f1. But that doesn't really change the nature of the position. Now we go rook c1, forcing the rook trade. The last thing on our checklist is a move like h6, just making some luft. We can do that right now. Since we're holding the tension, we can play h6. One of the benefits of playing h6 as opposed to g6 is we're creating an anchor point for the bishop on g5, which ultimately will pressure the e3 pawn even further and potentially lead to even more trades. b4. Sure. Now, what's the drawback of this move? Well, a lot of you are like, okay, en passant is forced because that's kind of a meme. Well, en passant is not actually forced. The moment b4 is played on the board, what I see is this pawn on a3 becomes a serious backward pawn. And we have the machinery, we have the perfect machinery to exploit a backward pawn. Now, do we want to refrain from the rook trade? No. If we put this rook back on c3, white's going to go rook a1. So let's start by taking on e1 and then bringing the other rook up to c3. And white's going to collapse here very, very quickly. We've got too many pressure points in white's position. If white plays knight takes c1, we could have played rook c1. Now we play rook c3, quickly checking that there are no discoveries. If knight c4, you should have a response in mind because it does hit the queen on b6, so don't play rook takes d3. If knight c4, we just play rook takes c4. Or even b takes c4. And we emerge up a piece. And actually, the bishop becomes the game-winning piece in the end. This is just a fork. This is straightforwardly a fork. Yeah, queen e2, we play rook takes a3. The rook has plenty of real estate on which to evacuate, like knight b1, rook b3. And this pawn will fall. There we go. Notice that, like, our move h6 is paying dividends, like in case white plays queen c2. The funny thing is, white isn't even contending for queen c8, but still, always nice. Now, is it time to play a3? Not just yet. There's one more positional thing that we could do just to shut down any remaining counterplay. And I just essentially mentioned it, right? Queen c2 would have been more resilient. We can put the queen on the c file, preventing white from accessing the only avenue of activity. And now it's over. Now we're ready to play a3. We're ready to play bishop g5, whatever we want to do to win the game. Calm, turning up the heat, move after move after move. Yeah, this is GG. We have a minute left, which is plenty of time. Knight e1. Okay, is it time for a3? Let's do some calculation. a3, queen a2, and I see a nice tactical way we could win there. Let's do it. If bishop c2, that slices off the connection between the queen and the a2 square, which means we can play a2. That's something that you should notice, and there we go. Bishop takes b3, we can take the knight with another queen. or alternatively promote to a queen on a1. A little bit of calculation to finish the game. I will say as a disclaimer, I don't think I played perfectly. Like the first 12, 13 moves, I feel like I might have committed an inaccuracy or two. We'll check with the computer. Well, I definitely have stuff to learn in this line as well. Okay, knight c3. We can make a new queen, but let's start by taking on c3. And that's it. I think in 46 seconds, we'll be able to win this position. Notice that the bishop remained on a6 the entire game. Like, we actually didn't really need the services of the bishop. But this is the notion of flexibility, right? You come up with one plan, and in the process of carrying it out, your opponent does something bad, or your opponent does something you didn't expect, which triggers a completely different, like a change of plan. You should be able to do that, you know, without... that's not a big deal. That's just a normal part of positional chess. Is changing your plan based on your opponent's reaction. And actually, the bishop might end up participating. King g4 will play bishop c8, which is, of course, the best move in chess, as some of you know, when it is played. Okay, it's time for our opponent to resign. We can potentially check Anish Giri's course on Chessable to see what he recommends against this line, this knight f3 bishop c4 variation, because I feel like he might have some interesting ideas. Someone told me once that Anish is decent at openings. Okay, so I'm going to open an instance of... I'm going to open another browser. Our opponent lets his time run out. Chessable. Login. Okay. GG. Bishop c4. Knight f6. d3. Knight c6. c3. He actually recommends a fianchetto-based line. Interesting. So I'll show you what he recommends. Yeah, I usually trust Anish over myself. GG. So first, let's go over the game, and then I'll give you a little bit of a rundown of Anish's recommendation, because there's multiple ways for black to equalize against these anti-Sicilians. That's what you should remember. There's never just going to be one correct way to play against really offbeat lines. So bishop c4. After knight f6, d3, knight c6, c3. As I mentioned, the one move that you want to avoid at all costs is bishop g4. Believe it or not, like a lot of very strong players, including myself, have blundered like this. And after queen b3, like, black does have a way to stay in the game, but it's very, very depressing. Now, I mentioned that this is a Morphy idea. In the Opera game, Morphy versus Duke of Brunswick, something very similar happened. Very similar theme, which is this, takes, bishop c4, knight f6, and it's exactly the same concept, right? b7 and f7 are two very forkable pawns. It's very easy to forget about the queen sliding to b3. Yeah, essentially black is just losing on the spot. And what's interesting is if you play e6 and you're like, well, this is not so bad because black can play queen c8, you know, black is only down a pawn. Who can tell me why that's not the case? How should white proceed? And after white's next move, the game just like ends immediately. What should white play in this position? You shouldn't just satisfy yourself with an extra pawn. Yeah, bishop to a6, supporting the queen and trading on your own terms. This is just a flat-out fork, and you're winning a piece. Black can survive with e5, but this is a very depressing position because now the d5 square is weakened. So the other bishop comes out, and it's like +2. This is a disaster. Yep. A complete disaster. So Anish recommends g6, which I'll show you after the game. The move that I preferred was e6, and this is also equal. So it's interesting. After bishop e3, the computer actually does prefer to play d5. So the computer does prefer to expand. E takes d5, e takes d5, and it gives a slight edge for black. Just because black has more space and black is the better center. Now the computer gives the move h6, just covering the g5 square, short castle, and bishop d6. It's very important to play h6 because if you play bishop d6 right away, you're potentially allowing the little nasty bishop sortie to g5, and there's no reason to deal with the weakness of this pawn. So h6 is a good move to throw in. Why not? Then bishop to d6, and black is a very pleasant position. Very pleasant position. Remember that if white plays d4, how should you meet this move? Who can tell me? Like, what should black respond almost always in answer to d4? This is like a very standard, very thematic response. Not short castle. That just hangs a pawn. So the point is you should play c4. You should not play c takes d4 because this leads to an IQP structure. This leads to an IQP structure. And how do you assess IQP structures? Well, typically the advantageous side is the side that controls the square in front of the pawn. So after knight takes d4, or even after bishop takes d4, white's got really nice control of the d4 square. So this is nothing special for black. You should play c4, and you should drive the wedge into white's position. And one of the benefits of keeping a pawn on c4 is that white is unable to construct a battery against the h7 square. But white is really, really cramped here. Like, you can very safely castle. And black's plan here involves essentially playing rook b8 and continuing the queenside pawn storm with b4. And you might be like, okay, like, let's say white plays h3. Now you can play rook to b8. And obviously, if white plays a3, you can play a5, and you're ready to play b4. So black does assert a slight advantage with d5. I decided to play bishop b7, more like in the spirit of the position. More in the spirit of the Sicilian, short castle, a6. And yeah, bishop b3, b5. The position is approximately equal here. Bishop c2, bishop b7, d4. I'm just checking to see if I actually played correctly. Yeah, rook c8. No, I did everything right. Rook e1. And after knight g4, black is already clearly better. So it doesn't seem like a mistake, but rook e1 was a very serious inaccuracy. White should have played h3. And after h3, the position is approximately equal. I still would have played knight b4. And after bishop b1, who can tell me, this is a theme that I did outline during the game. How do we maximize our control over the c-file? How do we set up a knight infiltration to c2? This is a very common idea. Very common idea that you should be fully aware of. It looks very artificial, but it's surprisingly effective to play queen c7 because white is unable to get the rook to c1. And there's a beautiful tactic here. If white tries to get the other rook to c1, you can still play knight c2. And after rook c1, you don't play knight takes a1 because the knight could get trapped. You actually have the tactic knight takes d4 winning the game. Because knight takes e2, it's easy to establish, comes with check, and you win the exchange. Or you win the exchange by taking on c1. If white plays bishop takes c2, you have queen takes c2, you have plenty of avenues of escape. So white's only way to prevent knight c2 is to drop the knight back to e1. And now, having done his job on b4, the knight can move back to c6. So it's funny, the computer actually gives a repetition of moves. Knight 2, f3, knight b4. That's the top engine line. Of course, like, you don't have to repeat. You can play like a neutral move like h6 or, rook fe8, just a useful move. And if white plays a3, white does create kind of a complex of weak light squares that you can then exploit by reshifting the knight to a5 and c4. And the position is, double-edged, about equal. But this was white's last chance to keep things under control. Knight g4 was a really important move. The point, of course, is bishop f4 runs into e5, opening up the center with a fantastic position. D takes e5, you can play d takes e5, or even knight g takes e5. And the point is, if white plays knight takes e5, the d4 square becomes significantly weak, and you can drop in with your knight. So once we put the knights on g4 and b4, okay, white blundered and lost the game right away. Yeah, had white played bishop b1 here, I don't think that, white would have... White's position is far from tenable. Like, we would have played knight takes e3. Probably white would have recaptured with a pawn. And now queen c7 is pretty devastating because knight c2 is utterly unstoppable. Utterly unstoppable. So for that reason, white should probably take on e3 with a rook. But now the queen can slide up to b6, putting pressure on d4. Someone is asking, why can't he just go h3 after the knight jumps? Yeah, of course he can. But first of all, we can actually still go knight b4. We can still play knight b4, counterattacking the bishop. And then we play knight takes e3, which we wanted to do anyway, so this is kind of a waste of a tempo. So it's important, these types of games are very technical, right? They're not that interesting. My explanations aren't very interesting. But if you actually want to get better, you should go through this game slowly, and you should understand the motivation behind every move. Particularly moves like e5, and moves in the conversion phase. Why did I play e5? To close off the bishop forever. It's easy to establish that if white takes twice, we have f6 hitting the knight and simply winning a piece. So notice how there's always small tactics that essentially undergird these positional decisions that are pretty easy to spot. After d5, we start implementing a plan that involves getting this light squared bishop into the game and then exchanging it for white's light squared bishop, leaving white with two very ineffective knights. But once white played queen d1, I noticed that the c1 square was now potentially accessible for our rooks, so we did a slight change of plans, instead opting to double rooks and try to infiltrate c1. And then we went back to the old plan with a5. So notice like the flexibility in my play. Okay, I want to get one last blitz game in before I wrap up for the night. But before we do that, yeah, Anish recommends g6 in his chessable course on the Night Arf, which is a totally feasible option as well. Short castle, bishop to g7, and basically dragon style. If white plays, okay, white's main move is rook e1, short castle, and you just basically play this dragon style. Bishop b3, b5, just like I played b5 in the game. And if white plays a4, you can play b4, creating pressure on the c3 pawn. So just something that you can consider as well. You can do your own research, but e6 and g6 are both viable possibilities as long as you avoid bishop g4. And the same goes if white castles instead of c3. Again, you can go e6 or g6. All right, last game. Let's play one 5-minute game, folks, and then we'll wrap up for the night. We are over 2,000 blitz, so should be a pretty high-level game. And we have an Alapin. All right, e takes d5, d4, one of the main lines, of course. Knight f6, probably. Knight f3. Yeah, we've had this many, many times. Here, bishop g4 and e6 are the main moves. And here I like the old-school approach. If I'm not mistaken, the recommendation in the chessable course on the Alapin is d takes c5. But I really like this old-school move, bishop e2, which is a lot more venomous than it appears. Because, so you play bishop e2, black plays knight c6. It's always a great idea to include the move h3, just to sort of force this bishop to decide on a diagonal. Obviously, bishop takes f3 is just a gift. It gives us the bishop pair. And now we play the move bishop to e3, encouraging black to play c takes d4. Of course, one of the drawbacks of the Alapin is that this pawn on c3 prevents the knight from developing naturally. So in most cases, we want to encourage black to trade on d4. Ooh, that is not a good idea. It is almost never a good idea for black to castle queenside. I actually had a very similar game many years ago that I'll show you afterward. Now, our reaction to this move does not have to be drastic. It can be drastic if we see anything tempting here, and I do. But my immediate instinct here is just to castle short. Because eventually, black's going to have to do something with the c5 pawn, and when he does, the c file is going to open up to great effect. However, if you are an Alapin expert, you should know that any time black does not play the move e6, black is susceptible to a very specific type of idea. And I think this idea can be implemented here, and that is to play c4 and shove this pawn through to d5. So like the queen moves back, we play d5, and we create this massive pawn wedge in the center. Black is already in huge trouble. Yeah, this is just bad. This is one of the baseline ideas in the Alapin that you should be fully aware of. It's not always good. There are some situations where you are allowed to play c4 and d5, and then black ultimately starts chipping away at the center with e6. But clearly, this is not one of those situations because black's king is so incredibly vulnerable. Okay, so now, let's see here. You actually could play g takes f3. That's not out of the question. Not only is it not out of the question, I'm going to play it. I'm going to play g takes f3. Why? Well, very concrete reason. Because if we would have played bishop takes f3, black would have played knight e5. And the light squared bishop is a massive asset in this position. In addition, we always have this move f4 now at our disposal. But most of all, we don't have to protect the c4 pawn. And we can essentially use that tempo to accentuate our development. We also can take on c5 at some point. But I'm going to start by playing f4 and chasing this knight out of the center. Yeah, so we're chasing the knight away. Now let's play knight c3, completing our minor piece development. Let me think. How do I want to arrange my pieces? I want to get the queen somewhere on an attacking position. So let's go queen b3. The queen is now firmly situated on the queen side. We also have the possibility of castling queenside ourselves. And that is precisely what I'm going to do. Let's castle queenside. Black is going to get fried momentarily here. e5. Now there's a simple operation that we could carry out here. We could play f takes e5, knight takes e5, and bring the other pawn up to f4. We can also push d6 and try to put the bishop on f3. There's a lot of tempting options. But let's play it simple. So many tempting options. I like d6. I like d6. Because we won't get another chance to play this move. And the reason is, if black puts a bishop on d6, it kind of dries up the position. Now we're able to play bishop takes c5. And once this pawn has been driven into d6, like, what is the point of that? We're able to play the move bishop f3 when we want to and put pressure on the b7 pawn. Something's going to give here. We also have like a potential Greek gift sacrifice on the other side of the board. There's so many exciting prospects here. Okay, now let's play the move queen a3, protecting the bishop and hitting a7, trying to provoke a serious weakening of the queen side, and of course setting up the possibility of knight b5, attacking patiently. Yeah, black is in big trouble here. Probably black, yeah, a6 is probably better than b6 because it does prevent knight b5. Now, this is a point at which a lot of people, I think, struggle. Like, you've made a bunch of natural attacking moves, everything looks great. What on earth do you do now? So this is where oftentimes one patient move can go a very long way. And what do I mean by patient move? I mean a move that essentially brings the reserves into the attack. It's a move that might not, in and of itself, like, further the attack directly, but it's a move that shows your opponent who the boss is, and you never know when bringing that piece into the game is going to pay dividends. And I'm talking about the move rook h to e1. Black has no threats, so there's no need for us to panic or to do anything drastic here. Okay, so now we need to think tactically. And I think I see something really promising. I'm looking at the move queen to a5 here. Yes, we are going to play queen to a5, hitting the rook on d8, and preparing, under the right circumstances, to infiltrate the b6 square. So I'm beginning to see the inklings of a tactic here already. What am I talking about? Well, there's a couple of things to notice here. There's an x-ray that our rook is exerting against this knight on e8, and there's the possibility of infiltrating queen b6. Putting those two together should yield, I think, an absolutely devastating resource, which we could play on the next move, provided that black doesn't do anything crazy. Okay, which he did. I was talking about bishop f3, of course. Black makes it very easy for us. We can just play bishop takes b6. Alternatively, we could have played queen takes a6, and black's position collapses unceremoniously. Bishop f3 even here looks great. Yeah, bishop f3 in this position looks fantastic because the knight on e8 will be lost with check. This is just sad. Very, very sad for black. Yeah. Actually, after rook takes d1, you need to be very careful how you recapture. So think about how we would recapture if black plays rook takes d1. Okay, he doesn't, sadly. Okay, so now we're going to take on e8 with check. And let's see, how do we finish this game off? Again, this is the moment where you don't really need to do anything special. Just bring another piece into the game, knight d5. Cutting off the rook. And between these four pieces, something's going to give. We're going to have a mating pattern of some sort. For instance, we can move the bishop back, opening up the pathway for the queen to come into c7. This would be one option. Another option would be some sort of sacrifice, like rook b8 check. And a third option, I think, would be, wait, thank you very much, rook takes d5. And it's going to be checkmate one way or the other. Far from smooth, I would say, was my conversion, but it was good enough. Okay, well, that's going to result in checkmate. Notice that I took with the queen to set up this mating net, rook b8, rook b7, and queen d7. Nice, GG. So let's take a very quick look at the game, and then we'll wrap up for the day. I'm getting pretty tired. Let's see what the theory can tell us about this game. All right. So the first sort of interesting crossroads was after bishop g4. And if you've been a sort of diligent viewer of the speedrun, you definitely should be familiar with this position. If you've done the chessable course on the Alapin, you should also be familiar with this position. Bishop g4 is, I would say, one of black's two main continuations, along with e6. Most GMs, they play e6. Bishop g4 has been less popular in recent years because it's a very risky move, as you could see. But it still has a pretty decent reputation. So white has several options here. I know that knight b to d2 is also very interesting, preparing bishop c4. But we decided on bishop e2, which is the old school move. Knight to c6. And actually, and see, I learn new things every day. Apparently, c4 right away is already a big advantage for white. Apparently, knight to c6 is already a mistake. And black has to start with e6 for that reason. Black has to start with e6. Now we play h3, bishop h5, and we do what we did in the game, bishop e3. And you can do your own research. We've had some games in this line. But after c takes d4, we're ready to play knight c3. Yeah, the engine really, really likes this early c4. Engine really likes this early c4, followed by d5. And much like in the game, black would have probably played bishop takes f3. Here we should play bishop takes f3. And after knight d4, we just ignore and castle. And we have this massive wedge that we've driven into black's position. Then we can play bishop e3, chasing the knight away from d4. So we play bishop e3, which is a slight inaccuracy. It allows black to play c takes d4, which he didn't. Long castle is just suicidal. And yeah, after c4 and d5, the position is already terrible. But it's interesting. G takes f3 is actually a mistake because of knight to d4. So apparently, knight to d4 would have given black pretty good chances, sacking the pawn, and then simply playing a6. That's not really human. The point is, black will play e6 here, and black will eventually get control of the dark squares. So we don't really want to give up the dark squared bishop if we can avoid it, especially combined with ruining the pawn structure. So bishop takes f3, knight e5 was my worry, but here we can just go knight c3, ignoring the threat against the c4 pawn. If black takes it, we play bishop takes c5, and the open c file plays into our hands. Interesting. In any case, I'm kind of running out of gas, so I'm going to let you guys analyze the rest of the game on your own. I think my moves are largely self-explanatory. Just queen b3, preparing long castles, and d6 is a really, really nice move, I think. Opening up the long diagonal for the bishop, accentuating the pressure on b7. So if black would have taken on d6, apart from everything else, we can also go knight to b5. So folks watching on YouTube, yeah, we're going to wrap up here. This has been a pretty long episode. You can find this game in my game history and do some analysis on your own. But it was a fun attacking game. No need to bog ourselves down too much. There were some cool tactics, but nothing extraordinary. I mean, all of my pieces came in, and our opponent just wasn't able to deal with the pressure. Thanks, folks, and I'll wrap up the stream for tonight. Thanks, folks. Thanks for the raid, everybody, and thanks for all the subs today.